morning. Thank you for being here for today's genealogy program. Today is March 14th, 2026. I'm Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, and today's program is on your Revolutionary War ancestors. So this is a very fitting topic since this year our nation is celebrating its 250-year anniversary. Just a couple of quick announcements before I hand it over to our presenter, Terri Meeks. Coming up at the museum on March 19th, we have our community coffee and conversation. It's going to be a really fun topic this time. It's back roads and curfews. So if you have any fun memories or just want to come down and listen in on maybe teenage hangout spots after dark, that'll be a fun one. It's March 19th. We'll provide coffee and donuts, and that's at the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard here in Canyon City. Another thing I did want to mention is coming up March 24th through 27th is Pueblo Community College annual senior mini college. The Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center will be there presenting, and they have a really great syllabus put together, or course catalog, I should say. And so if you're interested in that, check that out, Pueblo Community College. And then the last thing I do want to mention is that this is our nation's 250-year anniversary, as well as the state of Colorado's 150-year anniversary. As a community, we have a lot of fun stuff planned this year. And a good place to access that community calendar is at the Royal Gorge Chamber Alliance website, royalgorgechamberalliance.org, and you can see all the fun things coming up. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Terri. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning. So we are going to talk about finding your Revolutionary War ancestor. With the 250th anniversary of the founding of the country, many people are interested in joining lineage societies. So if you have a Revolutionary War ancestor, we encourage you to find the documentation in order to apply. And if you don't want to apply, it's always good to document, find the proof that surrounds your ancestor. So we have to start by thinking about the relationship of the British and the Americans. From the 1600s through about the mid-1700s, England was involved in a number of wars, and British oversight in the colonies was really rather loose. And the trade regulations that they had were rarely enforced. And this encouraged the colonies to develop on their own, to develop systems on their own, especially the legal and legislation systems. The colonial governors were appointed in three different ways. Actually, they took in one way, they were appointed by the British Crown, such as Massachusetts. In another way, they were appointed by the proprietor of the colony, and that would be like Virginia. And in some cases, colonial governors were actually elected, as in the case of Rhode Island and Connecticut. In any case, the colonial governors had power. They could set up the legislature. They could convene it as well as dismiss it. They could appoint judges and justices of the peace, and they were, most importantly, the commander-in-chief of their colonial military. So the legislatures in the colonies were actually more important. They had the money. They could decide whether the governor should be paid or not. They could also make laws and make legal decisions. So that's kind of the situation we are in by the mid-1750s 60s. And we have growing tensions. The British had just come out of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended that war. Britain had accumulated a significant debt in defending their colonies against the French. So, in order to pay for that, they were going to impose a series of taxes. These taxes were extremely unpopular because the colonists viewed them as taxation without representation, essentially. And this is taxation is one of the things that is guaranteed to British citizens by the Magna Carta. And they realized that these taxes were in violation of that. They needed to have representation per the Magna Carta when any taxes were imposed. So we are in 1763, and we're going to see a series of 10 years of protests. So the first one came the following year in 1764, the Sugar Act. So here again, we're going to start. All of these taxes are to relieve the British debt that they had incurred from the French and Indian Wars. And what they wanted to do was control trade, colonial trade. They imposed taxes on sugar, coffee, and printed calico. These were all products that were coming from either England or the West Indies. By contrast, the only products that the colonies had in really significant numbers in order to export were lumber and iron. And the British attempted to restrict that. They would set up blockades. They wanted to curb the smuggling that was going on. And the smuggling primarily involved sugar, but molasses. Molasses was the key ingredient in making rum, which was very popular in England. So they decided to exercise more enforcement on customs so that they could collect the taxes on these shipments. They were losing a lot of money. And as we saw with prohibition, once you prohibit something, it becomes more. So to restrict smuggling, we're going to see more smuggling. The violations for any of these smuggling ships were vice admiralty courts. These were courts that were set up by the British Crown and had usually about 7 members, and the members were all British appointed functionaries within the colonies. And his keynote is they lacked juries. And being in favor of the British Crown, this legislation would go forward, and most people were found guilty. Following, we have the Stamp Act the very, very next year. And this was a tax on all printed materials, legal documents, even newspapers, pamphlets, and playing cards. And we're going to talk about playing cards in 15 seconds. It was repealed the following year because of resistance and economic pressure. The colonists had boycotts, and we're going to see these boycotts get a little bit stronger. So, they engaged in intimidation in the stamp distributors. There are images where they hung the stamp distributors and enforcers, they hung them in effigy. So not at all popular. The image on the left is the actual stamp that appeared on all these documents. The image on the right was the one that was the protest stamp. And it says essentially an emblem of the effects of the stamp of the fatal stamp. And when we talk about playing cards for centuries were viewed as a luxury item. And they did contain the stamp. So the Stamp Act was something that foreshadowed further taxes. In 1862, in order to pay for the Civil War, they reenacted the Stamp Act and put stamps on playing cards. After the war, as late as 1894, after the financial crisis of 1893, they had another stamp tax on playing cards. It was to reduce taxation and to provide revenue for the government. And the tax that was implemented in 1894 did not end until 1965. So many of us grew up seeing playing cards with a stamp. Following year, yet another new tax. The Townsend Acts came along, and we see tea, glass, lead, paper, and paint all being taxed. And this was essentially to pay the colonial officials. You have to remember that at this particular time, both the officials that governed were all appointed by the British Crown, and the military, the British military, was ever present in this time as well. The New York legislature, the assembly, it was so, the Quartering Act was so unpopular, and they refused to initiate it, and they were suspended for failing to comply with it. The Quartering Act was part of the Townsend Acts, and it, as the name says, it required the colonies to pay for and provide housing and accommodation for the British soldiers. It also attempted to increase the authority of the British government. They established the American Board of Customs Commissioners. And here again, this was to enforce the tax collection on shipping. It was going to crack down on smuggling. And the customs officials did have greater authority. They could, instead of just boarding the ships, they could actually search the ships, and they could search homes to see if any of the contraband goods were hidden in the homes. They, of course, continued to have the right to prosecute smugglers, and they did have a new vice admiralty system established. But this system continued to undermine the colonial legal systems that were in place. Here we see a poster that one of the protest posters. Nothing was thought of but this taxation and the easiest method of liquidation. 'Twas enough to vex the souls of men of Boston town, to read this under the seal of the crown. They were loyal subjects of George III, so they believed, and so they averred. But this bristling offensive placard set on the walls was worse than a bayonet. So with each of these taxes, colonists organized boycotts. And as I mentioned earlier, smuggling increased rather than decreased. And all of these things, this taxation without representation, contributed to the movement for independence. The colonists formed various committees. They had a committee of safety, and one of the more important was the Committee of Correspondence. These were essentially secret organizations that allowed those patriots to communicate and coordinate resistance efforts across the colonies. Paul Revere was a member of the Committee of Correspondence, and we all know about his ride to warn of the British troops coming. Most of these acts were repealed by 1770. They were so unpopular, they didn't provide the relief that the British Crown was looking for. But they did maintain the tea tax that was initiated under the Townshend Acts. So we come to a head. The colonists had assembled in Boston to protest the offensive presence of the British military soldiers that were occupying the city. And with any large group of people, sometimes you run into confrontation. The colonists supposedly were throwing snowballs and other objects at a group of British soldiers, and they opened fire, killing 5 colonists, and several others were injured. The massacre was a rallying cry for the colonists, and the already anti-British sentiment was further fueled. Because the British troops were very present, Captain Thomas Preston and 8 of his soldiers were actually arrested, and they were charged with murder. John Adams chose to defend these soldiers in court. He wanted to prove that the American justice system did exist. He believed in the equality and the rule of law, and he wanted to prove that the colonies could provide a fair trial. He did successfully argue that the troops had fired in self-defense. And here is the image of the Boston Massacre. And there's a little label at the bottom which says engraved and printed by Paul Revere. So the taxation did not stop. The East India Company was failing. They were overstocked. They had too much tea. So in order to empty the warehouses, they were going to sell the tea directly to the colonies. They were going to bypass colonial merchants and therefore undercut their prices. And they would sell it for a lower price than any competitor. So this wound up granting a monopoly to that company for the tea trade. They lowered the prices to an absolute minimum, but they did maintain the Townshend Act tea tax, and it gave legitimacy to the duty of that 3 pence per pound. So this time it was a direct response to the Tea Act, the Tea Party. 3 ships arrived at the wharf in November of 1773, and the colonists had strict orders that the tea was not to be unloaded. And this presented a problem. So by law, having entered the harbor, ships had 20 days to unload their cargo before they would be seized and the cargo sold at auction to pay the customs duties. Once in the harbor, a vessel could not legally sail again with the cargo still on board without special permission from the Massachusetts governor. The colonists asked that the ships return and barred unloading the cargo. So they had 20 days. Francis Roche, he was a 23-year-old ship captain in charge of the Dartmouth and the Beaver. So he was caught between a rock and a hard place. He had to unload, but wasn't allowed to, but he couldn't sail without permission from the governor. Governor Hutchinson was a British appointed loyalist, and he refused to sign permission for them to leave with the cargo still on board. And he wanted to collect the tax so that the cargo needed to be unloaded. And so the colonists took it upon themselves. And 100 of them, dressed as Mohawk Indians, decided to throw the tea overboard. They got rid of 342 chests of tea in just 3 hours. They did it by the cover of darkness. This was between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. And 92,000 pounds of tea went into the harbor. John Adams wrote in his diary, "This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I cannot but consider it an epocha in history." Governor Hutchinson, the loyalist, "This is the boldest stroke which has yet been struck in America. The body of people had gone too far to recede. An open and general revolt must be the consequence." So, why am I going backwards? I apologize. So this decision was, and John Adams was the one again that noted, the country was divided into 3 parts. 1/3 were loyal to the British, 1/3 in support of independence, and 1/3 timid or undecided. So the question becomes, which side was your ancestor on? Let's look at the combatants that participated in the Revolutionary War. I'm not going to read the numbers to you, but the organizations, we had colonial militias. There was the Continental Army, and we will look at this in a little bit more detail. The Continental Navy, they only had 3,500 men and 60 to 65 vessels. And that 60 number is throughout the war. It peaked at 31 ships at a single time in 1777. About 800 vessels, and that number varies, were commissioned as privateers. And it's important to note that 11 of the 13 colonies did have colonial navies. We have the British Army and the loyalists that supported them, a very significant force in the British Navy. The French became involved, and the Germans became involved. So who exactly were the colonial militias? They were your local townspeople. They were organized in order to defend their local community. They had to provide their own weapons and their own supplies. And we will see how the initial colonial militias were absorbed into the Continental Army. This is supposedly an image of militias. They seem to be consistently uniformed, so I have my doubts, but we do hopefully see at the local level what these people might have looked at like. The Continental Army was organized by the Second Continental Congress in June of 1775. It was created as an effort to coordinate the activities between the 13 colonies. At the outset, as I said, these militias existed on the local level, and there was little communication. So this was to unify the troops. General George Washington was appointed commander-in-chief. And as I just mentioned, the initial militia units that were in place were incorporated into the Continental Army. They first raised 10 companies in the first year, 1775. There were 3 major establishments. In 1775, they incorporated those militia units and formed the 10 companies. They realized that this was not enough. So in 1776, they reorganized under some of Washington's recommendation. The Army was still focused in New England rather than the expanded colonies. So there was a third establishment where each colony was ordered to provide 1 battalion regiment according to their population. So they actually established 88 regiments throughout the 13 colonies. There were additional regiments that were at-large units, and we'll take a brief look at them as well. Here is their uniforms. A soldier in the Continental Army had to be at least 16 years old. They were paid $6.25 a month. And initially, in that 1775 period, they would serve for 1 year. When they reorganized in 1777, that term of service was raised to 3 years. The colonies themselves often provided enlistment bonuses, land grants to induce enlistment. Their uniforms were initially a variety of colors, blue, brown, or green. And in 1779, Washington ordered the infantry soldiers issued blue coats, white waistcoats with facings, outline, and cuffs, and various colors to denote the branch or their home state. This "We'll defend" has been the U.S. Army official motto since 1775, and this is the march at Valley Forge. Those 14 additional units were to cover reconnaissance, artillery, guerrilla warfare, military police, and those that were not able to serve in the field were in a unit that were guards or worked in hospitals. The Continental Army, also authorized by the Second Continental Congress in October, and the Marines the following month. Initially, in 1776, the colonies only had 27 warships against that huge British force. So they took merchant vessels and they converted them to privateers. This is not the same as pirates. Privateers signed a contract with the government, which allowed them to operate in defense of the colonies. It is estimated between, I mentioned 800 earlier, as many as 2,000 private vessels were armed and functioned as privateers. And as I said, 11 of the 13 colonies had organized navies of their own. When the French and Spanish entered the war, as well as the Netherlands, that changed the nature of naval welfare's operations. The French especially initially were providing arms and weapons, and they came to actually New York first and they thwarted one of the British operations. They controlled the sea lanes in the Chesapeake region, while the Dutch and the Spanish were keeping the British fleet busy in Europe so that they couldn't blockade the American ports. Here are some of the Navy, Continental Navy unit uniforms. The British Army, we just finished the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. So after that, the British Army was greatly overnumbered. And as terms of service expired, they allowed people to leave the service, retire. So their size was dramatically reduced. Not only did they not have effective recruitment, recruitment pretty much came to a halt. They didn't spend any additional money to recruit soldiers or to upgrade their weapon systems. So they hired German Hessian soldiers, and we will see about that unit as well. Army impressment was introduced because they could not effectively hire soldiers. Prior to the war, enlistment in the British Army was a lifelong career, but after 1775, there was an option to be discharged at the close of hostilities if the person had served for 3 years. So we can see why people were reluctant to enlist. Enlistment was based on physical fitness. The people were usually between the ages of 17 and 25, but they could be as young as 12 or as old as 40. Most of the British Army that was serving in the colonies had 5 to 15 years of experience. They did receive pensions, usually predicated on 20 years of service, or they could get a disability of 20%. Because the British Army was present in the colonies from day one, many of them had their wives and children with them. As I mentioned, their force was dwindling. The constant fighting, they didn't want to enlist when they were going to be away in far-flung places. It was a lifelong commitment. So it was an unpopular profession. There was low pay. And as the war went on, the British needed more manpower. So they were willing to offer military service for people that had committed crimes, and deserters might have been pardoned if they rejoined their units. And we see the redcoats. The Hessians, we have to remember that George III was German. So he hired his British troops, hired German Hessian soldiers. They came primarily from these two regions in Hesse, the Hesse-Kassel and the Hesse-Hanau area. These were regular soldiers in their own country's armies. And they served as regular British troops, or as auxiliaries with the regular British troops during virtually the whole of the war. They were present in every battle in the war. Around 30 to 37,000 soldiers served, which made up about 25% of the British land forces. It was many of the Hessians, only about half of them actually returned to Germany at the end of the war. And about 3,500 of them stayed in the United States. The remaining of that 30 to 37,000, some 10 to 15,000, went to Canada to settle. And here are the Hessian uniforms. The French soldiers and naval forces. They came to the colonies' rescue in 1776. They had been secretly supplying the Continental Army with arms and munitions, but with the signing of the Treaty of Alliance, this allowed them to deploy troops and naval forces. Approximately 12,000 soldiers, but the more significant contribution was the 63 warships and the sailors aboard those ships. And here are the French soldiers. As John Adams noted, and as we have seen, not everyone supported the revolution. The loyalists, those that stayed behind, they did face violence and they did lose some of their property. And there are documents that show some of this. Many returned to their homes, their original homes. But we have to realize that by 1776, we are talking about descendants of original settlers. We are probably talking about second, maybe third generation British folk. Many of them fled to Canada as well. And it's estimated about 70,000 of them. Some actually served in among the British forces. And it's important to note that the British offered freedom. If you were of African American descent and you served in the British Army, you would be granted your freedom. It is also important to note that Native Americans as well were tempted to serve on the side of the British cause because the British promised to protect their lands. They recognized that there was going to be westward expansion, and the British were not in favor of that. So many of the Native Americans as well supported the British troops. When the Loyalists got to Canada, they were rewarded a title, United Empire Loyalists. Many were granted lands, and the Canadians provided, I guess it's the British Crown that provided refugee support. So, where do we start in looking for your colonial ancestor? If you have a suspicion that you have colonial ancestry, we want you to find the documentation at each level that proves this. So you do your basic genealogical research. You start with yourself, work backwards, and hopefully find someone that was living in the 1775 to 83 time frame. Focus on those living that are in the 13 colonies. But do not neglect that there were settlements west of the Allegheny Mountains, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. There were settlements there. So and there were actual battles there. So you may have a colonial ancestor there as well. Identify those that had possibly served in a military unit and which side did they support. It's also important to note that not everyone served in a military capacity. Many provided some kind of service, whether it be food, shelter, a horse, an overnight stay, etc. So, we do have militia records. There are state records, militia appointments, payroll and muster rolls, and bounty land records. If the militia unit was one that was formed early, those records were with the Continental Army and are at the National Archives and Records Administration. Otherwise, most of the militia records are published in books at the state archives, at state historical societies. There are adjutant general records that are in those offices, county court order books, and county histories. Patriot records, we find bounty land records, military service records, pensions, indexes, actual daughters of and sons of the American Revolution, as well as newspaper obituaries. And these are available at our normal genealogical sites. Oops. So what are bounty land records? They are certificates that were given to eligible veterans. They had to apply for them that gave them free land in the public domain. What they actually received was a warrant or scrip that they would use to exchange for the actual land patent. And that was the land patent was what certified ownership of the land. The warrants could be sold or exchanged, and many of them were. Few soldiers actually did receive their title. They did sell them. And the applications are available through the National Archives, but some of the actual certificates are available online. And we will see a couple of these. We'll go through quickly. This one is a state one from the Commonwealth of Virginia to Henry Perry for 100 acres for his 3 years of service in the Continental Line. We also find some that are a little bit not in form, but we see in 1787, William Ackridge, he's going to get 200 acres along Briar Creek near the land granted to William Tallenan. And this is from now the state of Georgia. And we get the diagram of the property. Widows could also apply on behalf of their husband's service. Mary McMullen, she's the administrator for the estate of her husband. He was a sergeant in the Maryland line, and she is entitled to 100 acres in any of the districts appropriated for satisfying the bounties of land due to the late Army of the United States. So this is one from the U.S. Government, not the state government. We have muster rolls. We see Captain William Helms of the 2nd New Jersey Regiment on foot. He's commanded by Israel Shrew, and people were enlisted for the duration of the war, 3 years or 9 months. And we see their various ranks. Compiled service records, those are for the most part military records, not necessarily with genealogical information in them, but they provide basic reports for the soldier with his rank and unit, any promotions, etc. And we see the compiled service records. It's important to note that the first slide is the cover, the envelope that these further records are contained in. For every one of those card numbers, there is an individual card that refers to that person. We see different types of cards. There's company payroll. This is how much they're getting, $6.60 for a period of 3 months. And we see company muster rolls when they appeared and when they might have left service or they stayed, and we will have more muster rolls each individual month. And we see also some receipt rolls acknowledging payment for various services. The most important are the pensions. And it's key to recognize that not everyone applied for a pension. It's also important to note that even if your person did not get a pension, did not qualify for one, the application still exists. The first pension law came right at the end of the war, 1776, and it granted half pay for life to those that were disabled. Unfortunately, as we have seen in many other records, there was a fire at the National Archive, so the pension records for this particular act are no longer available. We have to wait approximately 40 years for the next Pension Act to come along. You have to realize that many of the soldiers had passed away by this time, but those that were qualified, it got a modest monthly pension for their service if they had financial need, and they had to prove their poverty. So there are documents, there are histories where they are providing this information. This was only for those that had served in the Continental Army and Navy, and it did not include any service in the state regiments or militia. We have to wait until 1832 when a pension was issued based on your service. You got full pay if you had served 2 years or more, half pay for those that served 6 months, but less than 2 years. And it did include the Army, the Navy, and other Revolutionary War units. And for the first time, widows are eligible. So we see John Carmichael in 1832. He claims that he was born in Chester, Pennsylvania on the 7th of August in 1857. Great genealogical information. In 1777, September, he's entering service as a substitute for Michael Graham, who had been drafted. 1819, Philip Connor, he has enlisted in 1775 in Hampton, Virginia, under Captain Charles West, who was indeed in the service of Colonel Thomas Marshall. He served 2 years, and we've got a list of battles. He was at Brandywine. He was at Monmouth. And it's important to note, 1819, he needs to prove poverty. We see widows' pension payments. We see the list of the names of the widows and who they are, who their husband was, his rank, when he served, when their pension started. And these are pension payments from 1836 to 1850. It's a biannual system. They got paid in March and September, and they got approximately, it was for the number of months that they were serving. So when you see 3, they were paid each 3 times in that 6-month period. If we note at the bottom, we have Elizabeth Knight. She is the widow of Jonathan. And reading all the way over to the right, we see that she died on 20th February, 1848. So this is key information, because this is all before the 1850 census, where people were enumerated. Everyone in the family was enumerated. Elizabeth might not have had a tombstone, so you might not be able to find her other than in this particular document. Rhode Island had their own Navy during the Revolutionary War. So here is one of their listings. And it gives the name, the occupation when they were serving at sea, any promotions, whether they died or whether they deserted. And we see that quite a number of them did desert. Any discharges and turnover. Turnover means that they were removed from one ship and perhaps given to another ship. So we note pretty far down, this sailor died at sea, and we see that he is a Negro boy. working on the ship, perhaps working toward his freedom. By the 1835 and 1840, it was important to recognize those that had served in the Revolutionary War. And they wanted to know who all was on the pension rolls. So individual states might have taken a census of those people that were soldiers in the Revolutionary War. And we see from this chart, especially that right-hand column, where they were transferred from. Here's someone that died in January of 1831, dropped from the roll. Another one who died. Here again, this is important information in terms of the census and the lack of detailed information in the 1840 and preceding censuses. If you lose your relative that lived in Massachusetts, you find from this that they might have moved to Ohio, or we see transferred from Kentucky. Prior to this, actually, the gentleman, Mr. Dunn, lived in New Hampshire, had somehow settled in Kentucky, and now is in Ohio. So if you've lost a relative, this might help you. There is a pensioner census in 1840, and we see this for the state of Maine, for the state of Kentucky. Look at those ages. People are very, very old. The 1840 census we've talked about. It's just the heads of household with the numbers of people that are in the household. And I often tell you, turn the page over, go to the next page, because we see these two gentlemen amongst all the tick marks who had served in the Revolutionary War. John B. Fisher and William Connors. It's rare, but this is the 1850 census. And that last person on the list, Mr. Simeon Hicks, he's 94 years old, and his occupation is Revolutionary soldier. We get county histories where we see specific information where people served and their information. John Barry and Elizabeth Gilmore were married, but they continued their services to the Continental Army until the close of the war. We also get applications for headstones. This is very, very late. It's unusual for a Revolutionary War soldier to have gone so long until 1940. But when people do their genealogical research, they may discover a Revolutionary War ancestor, and they can apply for a headstone, a military headstone for their person. We get obituaries. This is from 1833 for William Walcott, a native of Maryland, and he was actually taken in prisoner at Camden. There are loyalist records as well. Many of them, as we said, went to Canada. So Library and Archives Canada has a lot of these records. as well as those who returned to the United Kingdom. We see that they too have records. We see more from the Ancestry collection. We have pension applications, 1821, and Margaret Whitney. She married Michael Ambrose in South Carolina. He died in 1810 in New Brunswick. And we have the affidavit signed by Robert Timpany, attesting to Lieutenant Ambrose's service. We have also loyalist claims for the losses that they sustained, and we see the list of items as well as the cost that he is requesting. We have loyalist claims decisions. The state of Georgia is going to pay for property claims, and we have the determination whether they are entitled or not to compensation for their lost property. There are very few, but there are lists of names of those that were Hessian auxiliaries from the Johannes Schwamm Historical Association, as well as the American Revolution AmRev Hessian mailing list. And that's a user supplied information as opposed to full documented. Clements Library at the University of Michigan has muster rolls for the Hessian auxiliaries. They're also available at the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, the Historical Society, and the Pennsylvania Historical Society. Here is that Schwamm Historical Association, and we see Hessian Registry, and we go down and we have, there are two, there's the Registry of Research Soldiers and the Registry of Partially Researched Soldiers. And essentially, it gives the name, what unit, where they might have been from, and the unit and the documentation of where they acquired this information. And this is the partially researched, and we just get names essentially. The American Revolutionary Hessian website looks very, very complex, but if you look at individual names of Hessians, there's a guide for how to look for the information, the various units that were composed, and we get the index of names and the list of names. The Library of Congress also has documentation, letters for the Hessian officers. And the Society of the Cincinnati, excuse me. They are the nation's oldest patriotic organization, founded in 1783, and it is organized for officers of the Continental Army and their male descendants. So if one of your relatives served in the Continental Army or the Navy or the French Royal Forces, they might be eligible for membership in the Society of the Cincinnati. They have this is one of those lineage societies. They have an application process, and an initiation fee, as well as supplying the documentation. And they have semi-annual meetings at their state level, and you may be entered into theirs. They do have, this is an older volume, and it's a history of the sin and the society. And I noticed that these must be descendants that have qualified, because all of these people are serving in the Civil War as opposed to the Revolutionary War. So they must publish volumes periodically that give descendants. The Daughters of the American Revolution. If you suspect that you have a Revolutionary War ancestor, I highly recommend that you go to their website, the dar.org. And you choose that GRS data. That's I'm trying to look what for what GRS what the acronym stands for. Genealogical Research System. And if you go into it, you can find they have listings by patriot, they have listings by descendants. It's a highly usable website, and it will help you if you are interested in applying. You just need to attach yourself to a already existing member and provide the documentation up to the current day. The Sons of the American Revolution, they are SAR.org. They were founded in 1889, and their website is not as friendly as the DAR, but they do have the steps for how to apply when you find your relative. So I apologize, we've gone a little bit over, but hopefully we've given you some information and the possible documentation that you can find to document your ancestor that participated in the Revolutionary War. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. Next month, we're going to look at Pinkerton's National Detective Agency, as well as some other detective agencies and their service during perhaps the Civil War, as well as more recent things. So thank you for joining us this morning, and hope to see you next month.